Good afternoon and thanks for your time today. My name is Elia Hauge. I'm a local resident. I was raised in the Byron Shire and I still live here today. And I'm also a civil engineer in the water sector. I have experience in engineering operations at Sydney Water, and I'm currently working on my PhD research into climate adaptive planning in the water sector. Now, you might have seen a similar video that was presented by Professor Stuart Kahn from UNSW. And he makes the very convincing point that a resilient water system relies on a diversity of water sources. Putting all of our reliance on rainfall, especially rainfall in a single catchment, does not provide enough diversity and is not in the best interests of long-term water security for our region. This issue is particularly salient given the uncertainty in our predictions for rainfall in a future under climate change. Now, of course, the Future Water Strategy did consider what was called the expected impact of the future climatic patterns, and they've considered this in the yield calculations, which were also used for the options assessments. But I have some strong concerns about what's been termed the expected impact, which I'll share briefly with you now. But essentially, the suggestion that we can expect a particular future doesn't take into account the uncertainty around the predictions of rainfall under climate change. Now, firstly, the yield calculations assume 1 degree of warming above pre-industrial temperatures in the year 2030. This is based on a 2013 guideline from the New South Wales Office of Water. However, by 2020, temperatures were already 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, and they're expected to rise to 3 or even 4 degrees by the end of the century. But that's not the scenario that's being modelled here. There's another related concerning assumption, and that's that the reduction in yield due to climate change will occur at a slower rate between 2030 and 2060 than it does between 2020 and 2030. So the rate of reduction of yield will slow down after 2030. It's unclear what research has been used to support this assumption, certainly nothing that I've ever seen, and it wasn't a recommended assumption in either of the publications that are referenced in this section of the strategy. So you can see the projected impacts of climate change on temperature, and I'll leave it up to you if you think, to decide if you think it's reasonable to assume that the rate of change in yield is going to decrease after 2030. And also a comment on, on how these calculations were presented in the Future Water Strategy. So the New South Wales guideline that presents the yield calculation methodology, that actually dedicates a whole page to discussing the significant uncertainties in their methodology. But the Future Water Strategy reduces all of those uncertainties to a brief passing comment. So some of those uncertainties include not knowing if society will change our behaviours to reduce or increase possible global warming and the impacts of global warming. They've also used a medium emissions scenario, so that's not a conservative scenario for our future emissions and therefore not a conservative scenario for the impacts of global warming either. There's also uncertainty that's inherent in the global climate models that are used for our climate predictions. And those uncertainties are acknowledged by the hydrological community, and there's research going on to address them, but they're definitely still there. And there's also vast uncertainties when you take the global climate model and you downscale it to a useful sort of regional level. There's a lot of assumptions that have to be made in transferring that global model to a regional scale. Now, glossing over those uncertainties implies that they're nothing to worry about. On the contrary, we should be very concerned about the reliability of these rainfall predictions, particularly these yield predictions, particularly if we're proposing water sources that are so dependent on the climate. Now, I note that Rous has applied the IAP2 participation strategies of informing and consulting. So setting aside what I feel is the inadequacy of these strategies, for participation in decision making around a shared resource like water or a contentious project like the Janoon Dam, I'd like to draw your attention to the actual definition of informing the public under the IAP2. This is to provide the public with balanced and objective information to assist them in understanding the problem, alternatives, opportunities, and/or solutions. Now, I sincerely doubt whether a member of the public could be reasonably expected to understand the uncertainty in the future secure yield after reading the future water strategy. And that uncertainty is a really essential piece of information for people to make an informed decision about their own risk appetite if they're making a submission or signing a petition about the water security for our region. The point that I'm stressing here is that there is significant uncertainty in rainfall under climate change, and it's misleading to pretend otherwise. These uncertainties in the future secure yield have significant impacts for the balance between supply and demand in our region. Potentially, it means that our existing rainfall supply is at a greater risk than the current future calculations suggest. And supplementing this with more rainfall dependent water sources doesn't address the underlying issue that we just don't know what will happen with rainfall in a climate future. So what else can we do? Well, the future water strategy put forward a number of options that aren't climate dependent, like groundwater, desalination, indirect and direct potable reuse, so that's reclaimed or recycled water. And of course, there's also plenty more work that can be done in our region on demand management and retrofitting our homes and businesses for water efficiency. I'd strongly urge the Council to reevaluate these options, giving due consideration to climate change and the uncertainties in rainfall, floods and droughts for our region. Thank you very much.